Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining our webinar today, Scrum and HR, Elevate Your Initiatives and the Profession. I want to thank Beth Davis for joining us today from the Llewellin Group. She's really an HR expert and a Scrum expert, and I think going to add a lot of value and information today to help. My name is Eric Neighberg. I'm Vice President of Marketing and Operations here at Scrum.org, and I guess kind of the master of ceremonies for this event. So I'm just going to take you through a few slides, and then I'm going to hand it off to Beth, and she'll take you through the rest. If you can go to the next slide, Beth.
Yep.
So just some quick guidelines. Your microphones are muted throughout, but please ask questions. You can see a picture there on the right-hand side of how to ask questions in the GoToWebinar user interface. We'll take those and ask them at the end, or feel free to tweet at scrum.org, #ScrumPulse, and we'll pick them up there as well. Next slide. So just a little bit about Scrum.org. Scrum.org is the home of Scrum, founded by and led by Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum. We continue to evolve and invest in Scrum, driving it forward, focusing on improving the profession of software delivery, really helping organizations change how they deliver, how teams work together, and improving and continuing to excel on how Scrum works. This Scrum Pulse is a free webinar. We have many of them. If you go to scrum.org/scrumpulse, you'll see the list of upcoming webinars as well as recorded webinars, and check them out. Hopefully they'll help you to learn more. Our entire mission really in improving is helping you learn and helping you continue to evolve your knowledge and understanding of Agile and Scrum. The next slide. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Beth.
Great, thanks, Eric. And again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone on the phone. I'm very thankful to have this opportunity, and so thanks again, Eric and the Scrum.org team for having us. I also want to acknowledge a couple guests that are going to be joining me today. John Davis, who is my partner in Llewellin and also in life, will be with us today, and John's a professional Scrum trainer through Scrum.org and will help us throughout the session today. And have also special guests from the Life team at NetHealth, whom some of you may have listened to their webcast a few weeks ago around their work with Nexus. So we've got Linda Kreitcher and Kelly Collins-Ray that will be adding some commentary here too. And so we're just really excited to be here today. I think one of the things that inspired me is the work that John and I get to do with customers is to help them beyond learning Scrum and bringing the practices into their organization, really blending both of our backgrounds. So myself coming out of HR and organizational leadership for many years and looking at how organizations are actually enabling or sometimes disabling the success of Scrum, and how to use it to really get the maximum benefit for not just the products that they're working on, but projects and initiatives too. And so the real intent of our discussion today is to bring this conversation forward and really create some dialogue about how we can partner better from the HR profession with our business and technology counterparts, but also how can we use Scrum in HR for our very complex initiatives and programs that affect so many of our employees. So with that, Lindsay, I think we've got our first poll question up, and this just helps us get a sense for who's on the call today. So Lindsay, if you could go ahead and launch our first poll around, just let us know who you are and what your primary role is. The poll's now opened. Take a minute and let us know who you are. Okay, so we've got a great mix of folks here, HR
Okay, so our results
professionals,
are
as
up,
well as
and
Scrum
we
team
have
members, and maybe you play both roles. That's really great. Go ahead, Lindsay. All right.
No, I was just saying our results
Maybe
are
I
up,
lost her.
and
Let's
we
go
have
ahead and move
36%
forward.
HR professionals on, 14%.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lindsay. All right, one more question. So one of the things that I think is really important for the conversation is to think about where you work today, and for many of you working across the globe in different capacities, in different types of organizations. In your company, though, where you're working today, where would you place your HR organization in terms of awareness of Scrum and kind of support or maybe lack thereof? So let's go ahead and launch the second poll question and think about, where is your HR or people development or talent or life team as it relates to supporting or understanding what's going on in your organizations? Let's go ahead and launch the second poll question. Okay, and Lindsay, I'm seeing the results. It looks like a healthy mix, but a vast majority are acknowledging that there's some vague awareness of Scrum being used, and I think that's maybe what we assumed. And I would say a lot of organizations fall into the same mix. There's a lot of conversation around organizational agility, but Scrum is one of those things that a lot of folks aren't maybe as well aware of. And so, why does that matter to our conversation today? Really what outcomes we're looking for to share is first and foremost to create a conversation, both within this time together today, but also for you in your organizations and companies that you work in, is, one, talking about where HR is or is not involved in Scrum adoption. And Linda and Kelly in a minute are going to share a little bit about their journey and where they are today. But also what limiting assumptions exist about HR. And having, been in the profession for my entire career, there are a lot of assumptions, just like there are with other professions. But how does that limit the success that you can really get through working in closer partnerships? Secondarily, we want to make sure we're helping to raise awareness of how HR can be your ally in launching and sustaining Scrum across your teams and organizations. And also from a change leadership and culture perspective, where the support from those folks can really help make that shift work or not. And John's going to talk a little bit about some of our experiences where active change leadership and cultures that are willing to support Scrum really help make that shift to the work approaches much easier, not necessarily simple, but easier, but also where it gets in the way as well. And then finally, at the end, talking a little bit about Scrum for HR, and given the complexity of a number of the initiatives that HR leads in organizations or participates in, where we can actually explore helping HR make the shift in their people practices, but also the initiatives that support Scrum. So yeah, thinking about being dialed in together, and Eric talked about, the real mission of Scrum, in particular these sessions, is around aligning the business and technology and how everyone works together. And what often happens when, from an HR perspective, we're not dialed in to the same language or station, if you will, of our business or of the technology teams that we're supporting, oftentimes you get a lot of static, and sometimes we can actually actively work against or even unintentionally disengage our team members because the work that we're putting forth, or the practices that we have in place actually don't support the Scrum teams. And so Linda and Kelly, if I could ask you to maybe just give us some perspective about the journey that you've been on at NetHealth and what you've discovered as you've learned more about Scrum and the approaches that you've taken at NetHealth to really enable that to increase your partnerships with the folks that you work with.
Well, thanks, Beth. This is Linda, and I'm going to have to give Kelly all the credit for introducing us to Scrum. She actually attended an event where Beth was speaking. It was an HR event, and she came back and she's like, we should talk to her. We need to learn a little bit more about this. So I'm going to let her just tell a little bit of the story of how we got introduced and where we've gone from there.
Sure. So I would say before this year, we were probably in that vaguely aware category. So we heard a lot of the Scrum language. We knew it's something that we were doing, but we didn't truly know what that meant. So this year, we've really participated in a lot of training to learn about what Scrum is. We've also worked with our organization through shadowing Scrum teams and interviewing people and asking questions to learn more about how it's being used at NetHealth. So we've invested a lot of time in just learning ourselves and making sure we have the knowledge to understand what it is that our teams are doing and how we can better support them and hopefully align all of our HR practices with how they're doing work today.
Yeah, and I think where it's we'll also have to give a shout out to our Scrum teams, because when we went to them and said, we're just learning a little bit about this, would it be possible for us to sit in and shadow you and just watch and see how you do it? They were very accommodating. They welcomed us. As a matter of fact, my calendar is still full of meeting invitations for sprint reviews and sprint planning and all those kinds of things. But I'm not quite sure they knew what to make of us at first, but we're like, we just want to be the fly on the wall and just see how it's really done in real life, and just to get a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more understanding. And then we've actually dipped our toe in the water just a tiny bit as we call it a life team. It's our HR function. And we've started using the methodology for at least one of our big projects that we've undertaken this year. And we have plans to try it with another one. And it's really helped us. I mean, it's helped us be more focused. It's helped us get things done, and really, I think, probably prioritize the most valuable activities to do first. So we're believers at this point. I would say we're still novices. We're learning, we're understanding. Probably the biggest impact, though, that I see starting to happen is as we support our business from an HR perspective, we have a better understanding of the kind of work that they do and how they do it than we ever did before. And I'll talk about one example in particular. We've talked about performance management and how if you really want us to be honest, nobody really likes it that much. It's a cumbersome process, and we have a pretty traditional system where we set goals at the beginning of the year and then work according to those goals and review them at the end of the year and make pay decisions and all kinds of things based on that. When we started to understand a little bit more about how the Scrum teams are working, it was clear to us that those yearly goals really have no value to them at all, because that's just not how they think about their work. So for us to be pushing a performance management system that's completely polar opposite from the way people work just doesn't make sense. Now, I can't tell you we've figured out exactly what to do instead yet, but now we have a better understanding of the kind of business approach that we need to support. And we're trying to get creative around it. And I'll just put a call out there. If anybody's figured it out, please call us. We might even pay money to help, to borrow some of your great ideas. But I think it's helped us. We're not going to be good HR support if we really don't understand the business that we're supporting. So this is a way that's really helped us take a step forward.
That's great. Now, and I think one of the comments that you made that I want to point back to is the uncertainty initially of what your interest was really all about. And so I think Kelly and Linda, thank you for sharing very openly and a little vulnerably that you didn't know what was going on in your organization, and then showing that courage to reach out and learn more about it. And I think the highlight that you made about performance management is a wonderful tie-in to, there's lots of places, and we'll get into that in a little bit, of where having that awareness really helps you guys shape the way that you deliver and serve the employees. So again, Linda and Kelly, thank you so much for sharing, and we will see you again very soon.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both. So let's think about, from a perspective of what Linda and Kelly were talking about, what makes you, if you're on, especially if you're not one of the HR professionals on the phone, what might make it such that the organization, or that you don't want to invite your HR team to learn more about Scrum or become more involved? So we're going to launch our final poll question here, but really think about, in your organization, why HR maybe hasn't been invited to become more involved. Does it have to do with just maybe we're so excited in getting started with Scrum and doing this work together that we didn't even think about it? Or maybe there's some underlying assumptions about why HR wants to get involved. So let's go ahead, Lindsay, and launch that poll and see what some of our responses are. Okay. It looks like, again, a healthy balance. And, what's interesting about the response, 42% are saying that HR is only seen as an administrative function in our company. What's the benefit of including them? And that's actually what we're going to talk a lot about. And also, many of you talked about getting busy using Scrum and being excited about it, that we just didn't stop to think about it. So I think for the rest of our time together today, we're going to talk about ways to include and get folks involved in really helping not just use it, but also where it actually can benefit you and your teams and your companies. And so if you think about people practices and all the different functions that we do to run a business, there are so many that demand attention when you're using Scrum, and particularly when you're making a shift. And John and I, have worked with teams and organizations of varying size. And when, these things aren't addressed at some point, it does show up as potentially a barrier to the larger scale transformations that a lot of companies are moving towards. And whether that's multi-billion-dollar global companies or smaller startups, these are things that you really want to be thinking about to make sure that they align. You heard Kelly and Linda talk about performance as one of them. I lead the list with company values and culture, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But things like how you hire people and onboard them, and learning and goal planning and technology and org structure and design and workforce planning and on and on. All of these things demand attention when you're thinking about using Scrum, whether it's within a smaller part of the organization, whether you're a product organization, or if you're thinking about, like one of our clients, actually scaling Scrum as an approach to deliver on the top level initiatives across the global organization, some with and without technology components to them. Well, if we start to ask that teams to form around these strategic initiatives to support shared goals, eventually these things are going to bubble up as potential barriers to the teams working in these new ways. So, if we've made it okay, that's a first step culturally and values-wise. But eventually, a lot of the practices and processes are going to get in the way of the success. So just something to think about as we dive in. And if you think about just from an organizational perspective, I imagine that many of you at some level have some of these things on the screen on your strategic goal list, or it's something that you've heard about, or you talk about, or you just think about, right? So reducing complexity and increasing innovation, aligning to shared goals for competitive advantage, creating a learning culture and coaching capabilities, retaining, engaging, developing your employees, and eliminating silos to increase agility, right? This is all happening in most organizations these days. And if any of you saw or read the Harvard Business Review article and study around new rules for talent management that came out in March, April this year around HR, quote unquote, going agile, I think for us, a lot of the work that we get to do is helping organizations realize these goals through not only understanding Scrum and its value and how it can help them achieve these, but really creating a culture that empowers cross-functional teams to work together. So all that to say that, Scrum in our mind really has something to lend to an organization, but there's often barriers that come up. So we have one more poll question. I thought we had only that last one, but we have one more. Thinking about the organizations that you work in today or the teams that you're working, what is the biggest barrier to success in your company? And things like, the first answer, using Scrum as a process, and I put it in quotes, process to control, or a project management approach. Is it about leadership support? Is it about our practices, or is it our culture that actually limits the value that we're getting from using Scrum in our organizations for the most important products and initiatives? So Lindsay, go ahead and launch our last poll, and we'll see what the group has to say. Another couple seconds. All right. Looking at the results, it's encouraging that A is actually the lowest one around using it for process for control. So a thumbs up for that. But 43% of you are talking about company culture and behaviors that maybe limit, the value creation and potential of the Scrum teams. And John and I see this often, and it's maybe not because there's an intention to have a culture that blocks this, but the lack of awareness and understanding isn't there. And usually what happens, we see, is that organizations end up with really good intentions, trying to get Scrum going and really using it as a way to deliver value more frequently and have that cross-functional collaboration. But what often happens is better, sameness, faster. Because of these cultural dynamics that come into play. And, some of the work that I also do with our clients is around helping the leadership teams create a servant leadership culture and actually taking them through a journey, an experience from the executive teams on down to shift their own attitudes and emotions about how they see and think about people and situations, to create that servant leadership approach and environment that actually helps bolster the adoption and use of Scrum as a way to execute. So that's a lot of the work that we do. And if you think about the challenge of change, right, whether you're in a Scrum team and you're really excited about getting, Scrum going, or maybe you're coming at this from an enterprise perspective and you're saying, how do I lead this transformation? I will tell you, research will prove to you that over 80% of all change efforts fail to produce their intended results. If you think about the dynamics and dimensions of work, we all are in business to do something that's either to produce, deliver, or serve, right? And there are approaches and ways of working and collaborating that fit in that second dimension, and Scrum generally resides there. However, if we ignore that third dimension around how we think, interact, behave, those type of behavioral things are really what get in the way of any change effort, including a shift to using Scrum at scale or even within teams, is that if we're ignoring that, we're going to potentially be over-focused on problems and not get the results more consistently that we're looking for. And that's where that piece of our work really comes into play. And no surprise, your culture of your company may actively be working against Scrum to a point where it is disengaging people. And you know, there's recent examples of folks that John and I have worked with that move from traditional project management roles and what have you, but the culture around them, because the leaders don't understand what they're doing or maybe actively don't support using Scrum to help teams work together more effectively, people actually become actively disengaged and minimally check out, really don't put the effort into it, but sometimes they quit. And if we're allowing that to happen, you know, that's something to think about. All that to say, how does this fit with HR, right? So HR as an organization, we are always seen in my mind as the kind of stewards of the culture and making sure we create cultures that, you know, help people come to work and thrive and not feel like they're there as prisoners, quite frankly. And if you think about Scrum, being able to execute across the shared goals and purpose is really what can engage your entire company, right? And beyond the framework, you know, the Scrum values link beautifully and support every company's core values and can actually strengthen them. And that's something that we've seen time and again, is that we can show nothing in the Scrum values actually detract from your corporate values. In fact, they can breathe more life into them. And some of the work that we're doing actually in the process of building a product using Scrum, of course, I'm acting as a product owner to create key behavior indicators and measures that allow Scrum teams to actually moderate themselves from a behavioral standpoint to see where those values are and are not showing up in action as they work together through their sprints to really help them see and co-create a culture that allows Scrum to thrive. So, you know, all that talking from me, right? Let's maybe shift gears and talk to John for a minute. So, John, you know, being passionate about Scrum and the values, where do you see, or maybe tell us about your experience and point of view on how Scrum values have, you know, guide and really open up teamwork in the organizations that we're getting to work with?
Yeah, thank you. So I think you can't talk about passion without talking about what you really love. So I'll start off with that. I think I really love this slide where you see the Scrum values are defined now as part of Scrum. You know, the Scrum community really openly embraces what Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland were able to do for us by making that part of Scrum. These values are now clearly defined because they're recognized to be what brings Scrum to life. Otherwise, Scrum might just be considered a framework. So this is about our behaviors and how we think and act. So seeing that, you know, some of you that are clever with Google can go out and find a nice video of Jeff and Ken actually, you know, sitting with Dave West, CEO of Scrum.org, talking about why they added those values, why they felt it was important, what their point of view is on those values, what their observations have been over the couple of decades that Scrum's been around. So I think that's something you can pursue, and definitely read the Scrum Guide. As far as something that we've seen in working with our customers, you know, what we've seen work is where Scrum inside of an organization really nicely weaves to the existing company values. So, you know, almost 100% of the time you see the Scrum values weave into what the company already has for their known values. So it's something that leaders can quickly get behind and really start promoting with their people. It's almost intuitive to them once we explain the point of those values being in play within the teamwork that follows. So helping them really understand how to be more successful with Scrum by starting at a values level with the leaders is where we end up in conversation very quickly. Just by virtue of knowing that the values are really clearly defined, we talk about what they might look like in action. It also then immediately starts to highlight what might be seen as a cultural impediment, you know, where our values are in conflict with these new values, or where we might not yet understand what these values really mean and how to interpret them or navigate them in situations. So, you know, we could see those things show up that maybe stand in the way of greatness and more importantly, you can see where they're absent. So just do a little bit of storytelling. We've seen time and again where we go into organizations of all different shapes and size, and they're using Scrum or just getting started with it. And there are people not only initially underestimate the multiplier of performance, that something like focus. Focus is one of the Scrum values, right? So we'll expand on this. But something like focus will bring to the performance of the teams or the organizations. But also we can see from a cultural standpoint how people visibly resist focus, as if it's something somehow that holds them, would hold them back from something better. So they're preserving the idea that focus is a bad thing for some reason. So we spend some time with the leaders exploring to help them move beyond that kind of a limit. So I'd say that, with Scrum, we hear a lot about delivering incremental value and higher engagement of employees, and those are good things. We really show how Scrum values are effective at helping us see who we really are at any point in time when we're using Scrum or as an organization. And it shows us how the culture work that we have to do, that takes a big investment, and it takes a lot of time for a lot of organizations to change their culture, but it shows how that culture work directly translates into actually delivering greater value and creates actual higher engagement. So there's some proof that comes out of that work. It's not just intangible stuff. But again, something like focus, we all know in theory it serves the basis of real true teamwork, where teams share incremental goals. They set and achieve incremental goals to what matters to their customers that they served. And also the leaders, we see them empowering themselves and their teams to move incrementally toward a shared vision, maybe that the company moves towards its own future greatness, right? So, but that's not good enough to just hear about that. We actually work with them to sprint by sprint, try to target specific improvements through culture work to see if creating greater focus actually moves the needle on what matters to you with your goals and with how you better want to serve your customers. So I know it's high level for a call like this. We love telling the deeper stories, but just something like focus is so important and integral, and we could spend all day talking about probably all of these or each of these values and how powerful they are. But Beth, I'll turn it back to you to see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. And I think just illuminating, like you said, the one value, in the absence of any of them, we can all think of stories where what is usually getting in the way, and we point to that word culture, but it's really about those behaviors of folks on teams, and we're asking people to change, right? And so from a change leadership perspective, I'll tie it back from an HR standpoint. This is where having that powerful partnership and relationship, and even if you have a perception like some of you do that HR is more of an administrative function, that might be a limiting assumption that you have about colleagues in your organization. And you heard Linda and Kelly talk about it, that once the awareness rose, it all of a sudden has kind of amplified and magnified what they can do from not just a process perspective, but also from how we engage, respect each other, and understand their true intentions of what we're trying to do, to really start to open up a culture where Scrum can actually thrive. So I think we could, again, talk a lot more about just this, but I think in the absence of these values in action, typically that's where you see the behavior issues come up. And often what happens is that folks go to HR, right, to talk about a performance issue or a problem employee or an attitude issue or frustration. So again, connecting the dots of the teams together is really important. So then just to round us out, and I want to make sure I leave ample time for questions, is, can HR actually use Scrum? And I will tell you that before I actually knew officially about Agile and Scrum, through John and Scrum.org, as I've learned more and more and have elevated my knowledge, I always enjoyed working on cross-functional teams. And I always came out HR from the perspective of, we're here in service to the business and we have to understand what they need from us. Otherwise, we're just hiding behind, policies and processes instead of actually being a partner. And I have always kind of, railed against this idea of, we need to be seen as strategic. I'm like, don't worry about being seen as strategic. Just go get involved with the business. And as I learned more about Scrum and the framework that creates the boundary for action for teams coming together to work collaboratively to deliver value more frequently, it just made a lot of sense. Working in global organizations that are trying to shift practices, systems, it just made a lot of sense to me. And so for me, I believe the answer to this is an emphatic yes, but talking about different HR initiatives, thinking about complexity, right? And every HR initiative is highly complex. So let's start where it's obvious, HR technology and operations. Many teams are doing not just implementations of systems, but they're also going to a lot more manager and employee self-service. And can you imagine if you had an external customer and you actually waited, right? This is so obvious to me, waited 12 months to deliver something of value to them. Well, guess what? We in HR and some of the implementation partners for some of the larger systems actually do this. They wait to get the whole system implemented and then put it on the employees and managers all at once and say, great, you now have self-service, aren't you empowered? But in reality, if you did that to your customers, you probably wouldn't have them for very long. Well, we in HR have to think about it that way. So right out of the gate, an obvious place we're doing kind of incremental delivery of value and releasing things in a way that doesn't cause too much disruption in the organization is really powerful. Think about operational process redesigns, right? If we're not going to go ask people to be partnership with us, we're just going to go be the expert tellers and say this is how you should run your business from a people perspective, we're going to disengage folks, potentially intentionally or unintentionally. What about talent management, right? Recruiting and onboarding, high efficiency, high touch. Many of us have had really terrible experiences with this. Many of us have also worked in organizations that were good at it, and creating a process that allows us to actually engage others, not just the recruiting team, but even thinking across silos in HR, right? How do we get more people involved in these processes? Kelly and Linda talked about performance management, really getting away from the traditional process and compensation's another place, but also things like job architectures and comp approaches. Who do we want to be? What kind of roles do we have here? These are highly complex things that can't just sit in HR silo. And then lastly, just from an organizational perspective, many of us in HR get heavily involved in mergers and acquisitions and due diligence activities, as well as implementing results from employee engagement surveys and planning, implementing a new location. Someone's moving operations to Prague, for example. In my past, we moved our global headquarters was in Pittsburgh. We moved European headquarters from Brussels to Prague. Highly complex because we're dealing with what? People, systems, and change. And so I bring these up as examples to say these are specific programs and initiatives that I've personally been a part of, and every time I can apply Scrum to it. It just makes sense. So it's something for you as HR professionals on the phone to think about your initiatives and where you are, but also those of you who are business leaders or even members of Scrum team to say, gosh, maybe I can see the application of this more broadly. Okay, so all that to say, just move us forward. The other option is for us from a HR professional perspective, and many of us in other professions, technology, finance, what have you, right? We have a lot of expertise, and it is really valuable expertise. But being the expert, right, doesn't guarantee success. Being that expert teller doesn't guarantee success. And just to really drive the point home, having that cross-functional team, not just of HR folks, but of technology and operations and the business working on our initiatives in HR is so powerful and can actually, I think, increase the success. And when you get those engaged stakeholders that can help you navigate that incremental change and allow that inspecting and adapting of plans, right, towards an aim, right, towards a vision, but really engaging with the organization so that we can hopefully increase people's engagement. Or we can keep doing what a lot of teams and businesses do, is continue the silos. And HR is notorious as a profession from having like silos within silos. And what happens is that we can actually actively disengage our employees and just not listen. So it's a choice. But I advocate that I think Scrum from an HR delivery perspective is really something that is powerful and is worth it. So what does this all mean, right? So the more you know. Here in the US, NBC has a campaign that talks about the more you know. So things that I would ask you to take away from today before we open it up for some questions is, from a learning perspective, as HR folks on the phone, go learn more. Right? Scrum.org is a great place to start. Read the Scrum Guide, watch the videos, read as much as you can. Go talk to somebody. If you know somebody in your organization is a Scrum Master, or you even think they are, or as a member of a team, go talk to them and see what's going on. Shadow a team. Better yet, join one. Right? Perhaps there's an opportunity to actually join one as part of the development team, not just shadowing, but actually participating and contributing your own thinking. From an engagement perspective, for those of you who are on teams or leading transformations or different initiatives within your companies, go talk to HR about Scrum, what you love about it, why it works, and also challenge those conventional practices, right? If we don't know that someone's not satisfied, how can we serve them better? This is using empiricism, right? We only know what we know, and so if you can share things that are actively challenging the team's success, you got to share that. And then lastly, lead, right? Invite that broader leadership team at your company, expand that adoption of Scrum, help them understand that there is a broad-reaching benefit to the organization for us working in these ways. And then, when something isn't worthy of a true Scrum team event, those values and the behaviors that come out of having experience working on cross-functional teams is so powerful just for day-to-day engagement. And it can really elevate the performance, not just of teams, but of your organization. And it keeps people wanting to be a part of what you're doing. And, oh, by the way, you're creating more value more frequently, whether it's for internal use or external. So with all that, I really want to say thanks to everyone, John, Linda, Kelly, Eric, and all of you on the phone who've taken time out to listen to us. We're very passionate. I think it comes through in what we get to do with teams and individuals, and just welcome, folks getting in touch with John and I to learn more, to ask us questions. And Eric, I think we're going to save this last 15 minutes or so if anyone has questions that have come in that we can hopefully address or at least talk about.
Great. Thank you, Beth. And thanks everybody for joining as well as for presenting. I think we had a great audience here, and this is awesome. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. I'll start with the first one, and I'll paraphrase these quite often, but can you share some additional HR practices and examples and how HR should adjust and can adjust to support Scrum and support the Scrum teams?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Performance is one of them. I think the other one that I really get at in my mind is around recruiting and onboarding employees. One of the mistakes that I've often seen happen is, teams start to go out and create all these new job descriptions. A lot of companies are hiring for Scrum Masters or coaches, or you see all kind of titles out there. And I think, HR being able to help not only understand those roles and help recruit for them, but as you think about your recruiting process, right, and the types of questions that you're asking in interviews beyond technical skills, adjusting to what behaviors make someone successful as a member of a Scrum team, right, regardless of role. How do you start to adapt behavioral-based questions to get at things like the values, things like being able to demonstrate your ability to be adaptive, how you think, right, how you collaborate with others. I think oftentimes in the recruiting process, someone will just say, it's my head count, so I'm going to go hire the person to fill my head count. And I think adjusting hiring practices that allow for team-based hiring, allowing for, finding folks that actually will thrive on a Scrum team is something that's really powerful, but oftentimes the recruiting process doesn't allow for that. So I think that's one. And then two, how you onboard folks and get them up to speed quickly to be a part of teams, and allowing these folks that you're bringing into your organization, whether it's an internal transfer or an external hire, to be attached to a high-performing team really increases engagement out of the gate. And I think the third piece of that is also engaging your existing talent. And as you think about how do we continue to create that learning organization, many of you on the phone will want to have folks get rotational experiences, cross-functional experiences. What a great way to do talent development. Get folks on Scrum teams, right? It increases their knowledge and capabilities, but it also can help you from an HR perspective achieve a lot of those talent development goals that you have by nature of actually just getting folks engaged onto these different types of teams. And then thirdly, having the organization around it be okay with people working in these teams and potentially not being in their role for a couple months, right? It starts to challenge what work we do and how we deliver different operational activities. So those are just off the top of my head ideas. I probably have a ton more buried in there.
And I'm sure we'll get to some of them as we talk through some of the questions. I think taking a little bit of a turn. So we talked a lot about HR supporting Scrum teams, and another tie to that is what are other organizations using instead of individual performance reviews? How are they taking another view of those Scrum teams to do this? I know, for example, I met with in the UK the head of VP of HR, I guess she was, for Capital One, and they were actually restructuring all of their bonus programs and their evaluations. Instead of evaluating individuals, evaluating them and certainly bonusing them as a team, because it is Scrum as a team construct. And so the question Joshua has is, what are you seeing? What other ways are you seeing to review individuals, and how does this change that?
Yeah, it certainly it demands that change, Eric. And I think what her example is one that I'm seeing folks. What's interesting is it is such a change to move away from that traditional model of it's like in education, right? You get a grade, and it's your grade. It's not the team's grade; it's your grade. So I think there's always that change approach. But what we're seeing and what we're actually advocating with a lot of our clients in the consulting work that I do with them is to actually reform a process that actually allows for that ongoing feedback, a heavy focus on behaviors as well as the results that folks are getting, but moving away from, in fact, one of our larger clients is a global kind of multi-billion-dollar organization, and they've recently moved away from ratings and are looking at how do we give incremental feedback that's driven by the teams, not HR. So that product that I'm actually building that we're going to have out soon is starting to drive at creating a performance management tool that allows for that ongoing frequent feedback. And a lot of the tools that are out there are configurable that way, like SAP SuccessFactors. You can customize the performance tool however you want. So some of it is HR is putting new old processes in the new systems. The thing you talked about, though, on compensation, this is one where the comp profession within HR is a big place for us to continue to educate on what Scrum is and the intent of working in these ways. A lot of companies, and one in particular that I was leading HR for a few years ago, we moved away from merit-based pay increases. We only used base pay as making sure we paid at or above market, and looked at keeping folks competitive in the marketplace so that we kind of removed compensation as a distraction from a base standpoint, and where teams and individuals could really benefit is on the incentive variable pay. And that, there is an aspect of if it's all about the team performance and I'm on a team that has some dysfunction, I may never get the full incentive that I could if our team was stronger, but it also creates a function of teams understanding the importance to everyone of how we work together and succeed. You can still get something as an individual, but to get the maximum benefits, it really starts to drive that team performance. So I think the understanding from the different disciplines of HR, right, because in larger organization, comp is a very specialized function. outside of operations and talent and recruiting, creating the awareness across those silos in HR is kind of the first step that has to happen in a lot of the larger organizations. So, and I think once that awareness is there, you heard Linda and Kelly talk about it, it becomes pretty, it's like a blinding flash of the obvious that, oh, our process doesn't even support this. How do we start making the shift? And it starts to just get at feedback and culture of coaching, less about let's grade everybody on exactly what they did or didn't do.
Awesome. So looking on the other side, we've got a number of questions that are kind of similar that have come in. Less about how HR supports the Scrum team, but do you have any experiences with HR using Scrum to do HR, to do their jobs?
Totally. Yeah, definitely. And whoever you are, reach out. I can share lots of deep stories. Even for myself in particular, I was in a role with a global organization many years ago. And I would say it was before I knew officially Scrum, but I definitely know we were doing Scrum, where we were trying to go paperless with every HR transaction, not implement a new system, so create something in-house and start to create across 5 divisions that had grown through acquisition. How do we create a shared service model for HR service delivery in a 35,000 person, $10 billion organization, right? So complexity out of the gate. And what we essentially did was form a team of cross-functional folks that we had our aim of what we were trying to do, and we literally had a backlog of different pieces and parts of how we were going to get at this. So things from self-service and transactional standardization and automation, so I had 2 SQL developers on the team, myself, a few HR experts, folks from finance were a part of it because we had a lot of budgeting processes to automate as well. And we literally just burned down through that list of different initiatives. And then every 2 weeks, the HR and executive leadership team would kind of assess what we created and what we built internally. And then we would decide then, are we ready to deploy this next piece of process into the organization? And we did that for 2.5 years to get to a place where we had automated all the transactions using, and some of you may cringe and may not at this, but we pulled SQL code out of an old JD Edwards system into SharePoint and used SharePoint to completely automate every single HR transaction without spending any money on a new system. So that's just one example. That was a large-scale organizational change. We've got another client that we're working with now that is really starting to think about how do we use Scrum from an HR standpoint to actually build learning and development programs that actually support the organization's learning needs, starting with the executive team shifting to a servant leadership model. So actually not just saying, how do we run this as a program, but how do we actually create collaboration within HR to build training and to build curriculum to actually support our customers internally. So those are 2 that are right on the top of my mind, but I definitely can share more.
So in some of those instances, who was the product owner?
Well, the one I would say I was, and I actually reported to at that company, the CIO was also the CHRO. So he wore 2 hats as head of technology and head of HR, which was awesome to get things done. But I was given kind of that ultimate decision-making of priority, had a lot of stakeholders, probably about 25 people would have been considered stakeholders, but ultimately I was in that product ownership role. From a Scrum Master perspective, this was a little bit before my awakening to Scrum. I would say we probably I would have benefited personally from someone in that role for some coaching, but definitely that was the role I played. And then in this other one, it's actually the head of learning and development. So again, reports into a chief HR officer, but she's really running as the product owner and understands the value of bringing in cross-functional team members, even from outside of HR, to build the curriculum and the experiences.
Awesome. So I think you've covered all of the questions thus far. And I think we're just about at time. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. I'd like to thank certainly Beth for taking the time to present this, and the team that's kind of come together with her to add some additional information and so on. So with that, thank you. Tune in to the next Scrum Pulse, as we have many scheduled, so check them out, register, and I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.